Welcome to English 1120 at Southern Utah University, our Introduction to Grammar course. This video will cover non-finite verb phrases and will focus on infinitive phrases. In this video, we want to define what an infinitive phrase is. We'll talk about diagramming them, and then we'll compare them to prepositional phrases to show how they're different so we can better identify them in sentences. So let's talk about infinitives. So normally in English sentences, we have tense, present or past tense. So for example, present tense in our first sentence there, he writes well, or past tense in the second sentence, we took a photo. The only time that we wouldn't have tense is maybe we have a modal, which is blocking tense. For example, they will visit us, and so tense is removed from visit. Or maybe we've got an imperative sentence, and remember, imperative also will block tense and return the verb to its base form. So for example, the phrase be kind. So we call non-finite verb phrases is when we are removing the tense from that phrase. So infinitives are a special way of a non-finite verb phrase where we use to before the base form of the verb, and we call that the infinitive form. So they can function nominally, adjectivally, adverbially in sentences. So let's look at some examples. Here's a sentence. He hopes to write a novel. So he hopes something. Okay, so that's something needs a noun. That's a noun slot. And we can put the infinitive in there, to write a novel. So essentially it comes from he hopes something. Another way to do it is we could use the relative, the nominal that clauses like we've had before, that he will write a novel. But if we could, instead of using the nominal that clause, instead we could use the infinitive clause. So he hopes to write a novel. And so we remove the subject because it's a repetition of the subject there. And we remove the tense, or in this case, we remove the modal from the sentence, and then we replace it with the word to. So that's where we end up with he hopes to write a novel. So another example here. We asked him to take a photo. So again, we can see that we asked something. And we could think of it as, again, the that nominal clause. We asked that he take a photo. But when we want to switch it to an infinitive, we're going to change the he from subject to the object form. So we asked him, and then our verb will be turned into the infinitive form with the to take a photo. So we asked him to take a photo. Here's another one. This one is placing the infinitive phrase in the subject slot. So for example, it's like, to hike this trail is an amazing feat. And we could think of this as maybe combining sentences like, people will hike this trail and it is an amazing feat. But we're going to drop off the subject here and put the verb in the infinitive form. So to hike this trail becomes now our subject, and then we have our predicate, which is an amazing feat. They can also function adverbially. So here's where we're going to look at where infinitives are functioning adverbially. So we have this phrase, to pass the exam, you must study. So another way to think of this sentence is you must study for some reason. There's a purpose for your studying. We're modifying the studying. Okay, remember, adverbs can tell things like when or where, how, or in this case, why. So for you to pass the exam, you must study. But because we want to switch it to the infinitive, we're going to drop the for, okay? And we can also drop the you because that is repeated in the other part of the sentence. So we can just say, to pass the exam, you must study. Now here's where we got a bit of a problem. So we have, to pass the exam, the room needs to be quiet. What's the problem with this? This is actually kind of a complex sentence, and this is a kind of sentence that someone might create without understanding the connections that need to happen in a sentence. Really what we've got here is we've got the room needs something. And the room will be quiet for some reason, and I will pass the exam. And so we could combine the room needs something with the room will be quiet for some reason. You could say the room needs to be quiet for some reason, and that reason is for I will pass the exam. Okay, so we can combine, as we said, those first two and say the room needs to be quiet for some reason, but because me is not mentioned previously in the sentence, we can't drop out the me. Okay, so that's why we can't have a sentence like to pass the exam, the room needs to be quiet. The room is not passing the exam. The room is someone needs to pass the exam. So that's where we can change the I will pass the exam. We can put that in infinitive form, but we need to keep me as the agent of that passage there. Let's look at another example of an infinitive functioning adverbially. So we have this sentence here, I was studying to pass the exam. Okay. So I was studying for some reason, and I will pass the exam. So there we can understand that I will pass the exam can now be put into an infinitive phrase. It will be to pass the exam. So I was studying for me to pass the exam would be maybe a longer way to put it, but we can drop out the for me there and just say I was studying to pass the exam. So this is one of the things we can do in English, right? We've got this balance between trying to be clear in our sentences, but also trying to be brief or concise with our sentences. And when we can be clear and concise, that's the ultimate option. That's the goal. But if we can't be clear, then we've got to add more words to clarify it. If we shorten it too much, we may risk losing meaning. Here's another example. They are traveling to visit their parents. Can you identify the infinitive clause there? It's the to visit their parents. So if we were to separate this out, we would have they are traveling for some reason and they will visit their parents. So they will visit their parents can now be created as a infinitive clause. We can drop the they and the will, and we can replace that with the to, okay, to visit their parents. So they are traveling to visit their parents. Let's take a look at some diagrams, and this might help us better see how the infinitive phrases are functioning in the sentences. So let's take a look at how an infinitive clause could function as the subject of a sentence. So here it's functioning nominally, functioning in the subject slot. To understand this book is difficult. Okay, so another way to think of this is something is difficult. What is difficult? To understand this book is difficult. And so similar to what we had with our other nominal clauses, this one we could put on a pedestal there. But one of the differences is that we're going to have this to understand. That infinitive is going to be the first part there. And we're going to use that to kind of like it's a preposition, but it's not really a preposition, even though it looks like it here. Okay. But it's going to function as the subject of that sentence. Here's another one where the infinitive clause is functioning as the object. So here, the judge asked me to speak more clearly. So the judge asked something. And what he asked was for me, or he asked that I speak clearly. But instead of saying that I speak clearly, we could change it to an infinitive clause, okay? And I becomes from the subject form to the object form, so it becomes me, okay? And then the action is now put in the infinitive form to speak clearly. So it looks a little bit odd here in the diagram. And we have our pedestal coming up there in that object slot. And we've got the me, but because it is now in the infinitive form, we kind of want to present it not as a normal verb on the main line, but it coming down to get that infinitive phrase, to speak. Here's another way of thinking at the same kind of thing. This is instead thinking of the infinitive clause as an object complement. So here it's still functioning nominally, but you can see there's a slight difference here. So the residents consider, sorry, that should be no S on consider her to be their hero. So we have the residents consider something, or they consider her something. We're going with that section option. The residents consider her something. And that something, think of it this way, the residents consider her a great teacher. Okay? And that would be one way to do it. We dealt with that when we talked earlier in the semester about object complements. They elected him treasurer of the committee or something like that. But here we have the residents consider her something. And the something is to be their hero. And so it also could function in that slot there. Here's one where we have it as an adjective complement. So here we've got this descriptor coming off of an adjective. It's not taking a noun slot or I'm not taking a subject slot or an object slot, but it's coming right off of the adverb, the adjective. We saw this recently when we looked at sentences like, they are afraid of something. They are afraid that they will be late. Okay. But we could also use an infinitive slot in that same position. So here we have Manny was overjoyed to receive the award. And to receive the award is modifying his feeling of overjoy, being overjoyed. Okay. So again, this could be Manny was overjoyed that he received the award. But if we want to take he received and put it in infinitive form, we drop the tense, we change it to receive, okay? And we don't need Manny anymore because it's already in there. So we just have Manny was overjoyed to receive the award. Okay, now, also, these infinitive phrases can also function adjectivally, which means they can describe nouns. So here's an example sentence. Ours is, it should say the first city to build this type of power plant. Okay. So we have ours is the first city, okay? And then we have this phrase to build this type of power plant. Okay? And so that's coming off of city because it's like an adjective that's describing the city. It's a city that builds this type of power plant. And we did this before when we dealt with, for instance, relative clauses. The relative that clause could be like this. Ours is the first city that built this type of power plant. But instead of saying that built, the city built, we're going to change that built and drop the tense and replace it with to build. And let's look at an example here where they can function adverbially. Remember, adverbs describe verbs. So we have, we stopped the car to get snacks. So we have, we stopped the car, and then we have to get snacks would be like for us to get snacks. Okay? But we can drop off the for us and just replace it with the to get snacks. The to get snacks should not come off of the car. Okay, it's not a description of the car. The car, it's not that we stop the car, that it gets snacks. You know, the car's not getting snacks. It's not describing the car at all. It's describing the stopping action, the reason for stopping. Why was the car stopped? Okay, let's talk a little bit now about comparing infinitive phrases to prepositional phrases. So infinitive phrases, we can recognize them. Usually they'll have to do the to. Sometimes to gets dropped from them, and that makes it trickier. But if the to is there, it's going to be followed by a verb. Okay? Because we need a verb for it to be an infinitive verb phrase. Whereas prepositional phrases that have the to are going to be followed by a noun. To the place, to the store, to my friend. Okay? So here's two examples. We purchased a turntable to play records, and we sent a letter to the record company. Which one of these two phrases is an infinitive verb phrase, and which one is a prepositional phrase? Take a moment to think about that. So in our first one, we purchased a turntable to play records. So the to play is a verb. It's the infinitive, okay? Whereas we sent a letter to the record company. The record company is a noun. So this is a prepositional phrase, okay? And it's telling where the sending of the letter is going. Whereas in the first one, to purchase a turntable, it describes the turntable. Okay, it's a turntable that will play records, but we could say that will play. We drop it out and just put it to play. Right. So we talked about infinitives, how they're formed, why we might use them. They can make things a lot shorter in a sentence. We talked about how to diagram them. They can function as noun position. They can function as an adjective position. They can even function as an adverb position. Okay? And we were able to clarify how an infinitive phrase is different from a prepositional phrase. Infinitive phrases have verbs after the to. Prepositional phrases have nouns after the to.